Hello and welcome to episode 241 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty. On the show today, I'll be covering a topic that is not nearly as cheerful as past topics. For well over a year, I've been spending an episode almost every month talking about the tenure of former Disney chairman and CEO Michael Eisner. Last month, we covered how Eisner tried multiple times to acquire the Muppets, and eventually succeeded in the final full year of his tenure. Well, today, on the 24th anniversary of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, I want to take a look at how the Disney theme parks under the leadership of Michael Eisner handled the immediate emergency on 9/11 and how the company adapted to the changing tourism landscape that resulted in the aftermath. The closest comparison in recent years would obviously be the pandemic closures 5 years ago, and it will be interesting if we notice any similarities or differences in the responses. Before we get started, this is my weekly plea to make sure that all of you are subscribed to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. We have been at this for over 4.5 years, and we want to make that next step in our growth as we look to book more and more interesting guests, as we try to branch out to other travel destinations, and as we just try to get more people to join our inclusive community of theme park fans. We could always use more subscribers. If you already are subscribed, make sure that you're sharing podcast episodes on social media, commenting on podcast episodes, clicking the like button on all of our content, and telling your friends about how this show has changed your life for the better. Okay, maybe that was a little bit of a stretch. I'm so excited because next week I'll be leaving for a trip to Walt Disney World. It will be my first trip back since moving to the Northeast in March, since I still have a few days left on my annual pass and will not be renewing. I knew I had to head back down there to make the most of my last few days with an AP. You aren't going to want to miss my videos because I have some fun things planned beyond just experiencing the parks like a normal day. A lot of you listen to these episodes on the days when they are released. If you do that, you are probably listening while I'm exploring the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. This will be another video that I will have coming in the next few weeks. I'm also working hard to create fun, entertaining, and inclusive travel content. Sometimes it's theme parks, sometimes it's sports, sometimes it's history. I always want to be entertaining and uplifting. Make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel at Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Now let's get to our main topic. In September of 2001, I was the overnight disc jockey on a rock station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was frankly a dream job for somebody who'd only been out of high school for less than a year and a half. I was living with my girlfriend at the time, who was a public school teacher, and I was playing rock music for the third shift workers, especially the ones at the Harley-Davidson plant in York, 6 hours every night. Free concerts, free music, and a job where I could be creative. Most mornings I developed a routine. I would finish my shift at 6 o'clock because we were an affiliate of the Howard Stern Show. I would listen to Howard on my way home and watch the Today Show while my girlfriend got ready for work. When she left, I would either go to bed or play a few hours of a baseball video game. On September 11th, I was particularly tired. It was the week of the York Fair, so I had worked a lot over the weekend at the station's tent at the fair, meeting listeners, doing giveaways. That stuff was great. It was awesome to interact with listeners, but it was tiring. That night was also the big Three Doors Down in Nickelback concert at the fair, so the building was going to be busy during my shift with people coming back from that. I wasn't going to be able to get away with my normal overnight sweatpants and hoodie attire. I also wanted to get up early in the afternoon to go to the mall. There were 2 CDs being released that day that I wanted to buy at Sam Goody. Stone Gossard, Pearl Jam's guitarist, was releasing a solo album that day, and Bob Dylan was releasing his album Love and Theft. I always watched the Today Show and specifically remember watching it that morning because they were talking about the mayoral election in New York. By the time I turned off the television, it must have been about 2 minutes before they started reporting on the plane hitting the first tower. By the time my girlfriend got home, it was the middle of the afternoon. All she could find a way to say was, "The Pentagon's on fire and the World Trade Center is gone." I walked downstairs, still in a haze. I was so confused that when I turned on the television, I wasn't actually expecting them to be talking about it. As those initial images soaked into my brain and the fog of third shift sleeping patterns cleared, I realized that the world was completely different. That day changed my career in a way. While I would go back to college, I started working full-time on the radio right out of high school. I didn't have any news training. I learned how to be a radio personality on a rock station from just doing it. And I was going to have to teach myself the news now. In addition to being entertainers who took people's minds off the horrors they were experiencing, we had to constantly be keeping our listeners informed on the real world. We had to find that balance. As an overnight personality, there was a lot of news that was happening in the middle of the night. We were everyday parts of our listeners' lives. They wanted to vent to us. They wanted to yell. They wanted to cry. They wanted to be distracted. It took months for hourly news breaks to turn into every other hour. Eventually, it just became breaking news. By the 2004 election, our bosses, not wanting to get on the bad side of George W. Bush's FCC after the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction, we were now being told that news and world events weren't even parts of the job description anymore. The impact 9/11 had on news, reporting, and the ever-increasing political polarization of citizens could be and has been analyzed in books and college classes. Today, we're going to be talking about the impact the attacks had on the Walt Disney Company, both in the short term and long term. In Florida, guests were already deep into Magic Kingdom at 8:46 in the morning. That's when Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. The world had changed forever, but many people didn't even realize it yet. Early reports on the news were stating it was a small plane and could have been an accident. Guests started to make their ways into Epcot, Disney-MGM Studios, and the fairly new fourth park at Walt Disney World, Disney's Animal Kingdom. By 9:03, when Flight 175 hit the South Tower, it became obvious to most observers that this wasn't an accident. The nation was under attack. According to cast members who were interviewed by Huffington Post years after the actual events, they heard on the news that Disney would be closing the parks before the announcement came to their managers. The official instructions from the company were to get the guests out of the parks without letting them know what was happening outside the gates. To some of our younger listeners, this has to sound absurd. How could you keep a packed Magic Kingdom full of guests from hearing about what was happening in New York City? Well, cell phones weren't as prevalent or reliable in 2001, plus phone lines were jammed. Everybody was making calls to check on traveling friends and relatives. People were checking to see if loved ones in New York City were safe. Heck, it was a traumatizing event. Some people just needed to talk with loved ones to process what they were seeing on television. According to one of the CMs interviewed by HuffPo, quote, "We were strictly forbidden from telling the real reason that we had decided to close the park, which caused some confusion and maybe even some irate guests at the time, but it avoided quite effectively the cause for panic from our guests." After shutting down all of the rides, restaurants, and shops, cast members linked arms to make a human chain, slowly inching towards Main Street, USA, and eventually the front of the park. CMs linked arms with each other, while they carefully did not touch or make contact with guests. Remaining calm was paramount. Any leak of the news to a crowd that confused could lead to absolute anarchy. Much like in the early days of the pandemic reopenings, announcements were blasted throughout the park. Quote, "Due to circumstances beyond our control, the Magic Kingdom is now closed. Please follow the direction of the nearest cast member." It is those moments that you can tell something is serious. When Disney actively, willingly, and boldly snaps the immersion, it is time to do what you're told for your own safety. News 6 in Orlando has an incredible interview with Steve and Beth Shorten on their site, clickorlando.com. The article was written by producer Ken Pilcher. In that story, the Shortens talk about having the chance to do the flag raising at Disney's Wilderness Lodge that morning at 7:30 a.m. Steve got to raise the American flag over that quintessentially American resort on the morning of September 11th. The couple was already in Magic Kingdom and had some knowledge of a plane crash in New York City, but we all know how the outside world disappears when you walk under the train station. What struck me about their account of the evacuation that I didn't see or hear in many other accounts was the fact that many of the cast members were not in costume. You grow so accustomed to seeing Frontierland CMs in Western garb or Tomorrowland CMs wearing retro futuristic clothing. Some of the cast members helping escort guests down Main Street on September 11th, according to Steve and Beth Shorten, were higher-ups in full-on suits and CMs in plain clothes. It must have made for such a bizarre sight. Beth said, quote, "We took a boat back to our hotel. It was a long process, but orderly. With all the parks shut down for the day, we spent the day at our hotel. We watched the news in disbelief, as the rest of the nation did. It is understandable that I don't recall much else of our vacation." By the time Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37, those watching on television were now aware that this was both a coordinated terrorist attack and that the target was no longer limited to the Big Apple. All of a sudden, anyone in a high-profile location could be a target. Anyone who is traveling by plane could be a victim. Guests who were being blindly escorted out of the Walt Disney World theme parks were annoyed, but complacent as their friends and family members wondered if the next plane was headed for Cinderella Castle, or if a plane headed towards Orlando's MCO was hijacked to take out the U.S. Capitol building. At 9:45, the FAA officially shut down airspace over the United States. Travel would officially never be the same, and tourism obviously took a big hit with the changes. To go back to my personal story from 9/11, my boss had gotten married that previous weekend in the New York area. She was on her honeymoon in Italy when she was stranded overseas with some of her friends and classmates losing their lives at their jobs in the Twin Towers. Remember, terrorists aren't just looking to take lives. These attacks are always intended to disrupt. Watching the horror of this destruction from a beautiful hotel in Italy, not knowing how long you would be stranded there, if you would have enough money to stay there indefinitely, and wanting to be there to comfort and lead your friends and employees must have been traumatic. At 9:59, the worst case scenario happened. The brave New York City firefighters and other first responders who rushed into the building to save workers were selfless, no doubt, but they thought they had time. They were not careless or masochistic. They had plans to get people to safety. When the South Tower came crashing down, it instantly ended hundreds of lives in a matter of seconds. It also created a ticking time bomb for everyone in the North Tower, which was hit before the South Tower. If the impact was enough to bring down one tower, there was no reason to believe the North Tower wouldn't see the exact same tragic fate. 4 minutes later, Flight 93 crashes into the ground in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The 9/11 Commission stated that this plane was headed towards the White House or the U.S. Capitol, and that brave passengers on board heard of the previous hijackings and took over the plane before it could be used to cause any more harm. At 10:28 a.m., the final piece of horrifying video aired when the North Tower collapsed an hour and 42 minutes after the initial impact. The Marriott Hotel at the base of the two towers is also destroyed in the event. These visuals traumatize people throughout the world, but some television stations tried to keep the devastation away from younger viewers. Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network continued to show child-friendly content to keep young ones distracted while their parents presumably watched the tragedy unfolding in the northeastern United States in secret in other rooms. Of course, this is a podcast about Disney, so did the Disney Channel do the same thing? To tell you the truth, I can't find out the answer to that. I've seen conflicting reports that the Disney Channel did stick with children's programming, and that they went with the ABC News feed for coverage of the attacks. I personally remember checking Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network on the day and seeing cartoons, but I don't think we had the Disney Channel as part of our cable package. What frustrates me the most is that I would understand if I couldn't find the answer. Seeing both answers cited as fact, now that has me angry. This should be an easy thing to document. Disneyland and the newly opened Disney's California Adventure did not open for the day due to the time difference. This marked the second time that Disneyland Park would close for an extended time due to a tragedy. The previous closure was due to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. Walt Disney World had never had such a closure before 9/11, since WDW didn't open for almost 8 years after the JFK assassination. There had been, however, a few early closure days for the parks in Florida due to hurricanes. In the immediate aftermath, the government was giving off, to be kind, mixed signals. The implementation of a color-coded terror alert system went into effect throughout the country. Whenever the threat level was raised to a more dangerous color, it always led the news. Of course, subsequent drops in the threat level never seemed to receive the same type of attention. There were unrelated incidents that really seemed to keep people on the edge of their seats. Anthrax in the mail and other threats were popping up seemingly on a regular basis. On occasion, President Bush would get on television and beg us to spend our money in restaurants and stores. In several speeches, he even mentioned flying down to Walt Disney World specifically. His brother, of course, was the governor of Florida at the time, so he wasn't going to promote Disneyland over WDW. Still, the constant fear of attacks was keeping a sizable amount of the traveling public picking closer locations to visit. And at one point, the FBI had listed Walt Disney World as the third most likely location to be attacked in the United States. Now it's time to talk about the long-term impact on the parks. According to the Orlando Sentinel in 2001, quote, after the attacks, Disney reduced the schedules of about 40,000 hourly workers, cut park hours, closed some restaurants, and canceled some performances of shows. Disney also had been consolidating hotel operations and closing entire floors of buildings in some resorts. These cutbacks, in ways very similar to those of the pandemic closures, changed a lot of future plans for the Walt Disney Company. The biggest hit was probably to Disney's California Adventure, first starting off as a plan for a West Coast version of Epcot called Westcott. Disney chairman and CEO Michael Eisner finally decided on a park that would celebrate the diversity of California right across the Esplanade from Disneyland Park. Officially, Eisner believed that DCA would draw more people in for a Disneyland vacation, and that by showing them the grandeur of California, maybe guests wouldn't find the need to visit all of those other locations. In reality, Disney's California Adventure was probably always a compromise that had to do with neighbors in the area rejecting the huge park centerpieces proposed for Westcott, combined with the financial struggles brought about by the initial struggles of Euro Disney in France. 9/11 meant the DCA was going to be on its own for quite some time, with travel numbers plummeting even though the park was a joke nationally, even being referenced hilariously in several episodes of The Simpsons, which is now ironically owned by Disney. It was not going to get the help it needed with new attractions. It is important to remember that 9/11 happened right at the end of the Disney Renaissance, so the company was in fairly good shape besides that Euro Disney-sized anchor around its neck. Walt Disney World was growing. In 1989, Disney-MGM Studios opened as the resort's third theme park, and they didn't even wait an entire decade to add a fourth park with Disney's Animal Kingdom in 1998. That means WDW opened Magic Kingdom in 1971, opened Epcot 11 years later in 1982, opened Disney-MGM Studios 7 years after that, and only waited 9 years for Disney's Animal Kingdom. That was huge growth. 9/11 might have forever canceled the idea for a beastly Kingdom Land at Animal Kingdom, but they would get a premier e-ticket roller coaster in a few years with Expedition Everest. With the growth in the number of parks, there was also a need for more hotel rooms. Eisner was having huge success with opening on-site resorts at Walt Disney World. These were hotels that Disney owned, and they could theme in any way they wanted. In 2001, he wanted to build on the success the company had found with the All-Star Resorts, known as Value Resorts. All-Star Movies, Music, and Sports provided many of the same perks of staying on property at Walt Disney World and made them available to more families by providing a more affordable price tag. These resorts were built in a motel style and did not offer the amenities of a deluxe or moderate resort, but many families found other perks worth the upcharge from an off-property hotel. Pop Century would eventually open in 2003, but this was definitely an area where the impacts of 9/11 can be seen on the current map of property. The original concept for Pop Century Resort would be a giant resort on both sides of Hourglass Lake, with the legendary years on one side and the classic years on the other side. The classic years went on to become what we now know as Pop Century, with areas dedicated to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is where you can see a multi-story Roger Rabbit or Baloo and a Mickey Mouse phone as big as some office buildings. It has 2,880 rooms and was part of Eisner's initial plans. To get across Hourglass Lake, however, guests could walk over the Generation Gap to experience the legendary years of the 1900s, 10s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Eisner had Disney expanding all over the globe, and work on both sides of Hourglass Lake was well underway on September 11th of 2001. Still, if the company was now not even making large sections of existing hotels and resorts available to guests, did Eisner want to open 2 resorts that would add nearly 6,000 new rooms to the capacity? With the inevitable temporary downturn in tourism combined with the cost of completing and staffing the 2 sides, they would only be adding more supply during a reduction in demand. That would not only hurt the resort itself, but every other resort on property. The decision was made to move forward with the classic years and leave the legendary years abandoned. When Pop Century eventually opened in 2003, from certain parts of the resort, guests could see the abandoned, started buildings for the legendary years. It wasn't until 2010, when the post-9/11 economic downturn and the economic crisis caused, at least partially, by the collapse of the housing bubble in 2008, that Disney decided to do something with the abandoned buildings on the other side of Hourglass Lake. By this time, Bob Iger had taken over from Michael Eisner, and he had different plans for another value resort. While Eisner wasn't adverse to adding intellectual property to the resorts, Iger had almost an addiction to it. This is why the new plan was for a resort known as Disney's Art of Animation Resort, featuring 4 of Disney and Pixar's properties. One section would focus on The Little Mermaid, another on The Lion King, one on Finding Nemo, and a final section based on Cars. The delay in construction allowed Art of Animation to focus more on providing suites that could fit up to 6 people. AOA has 1,120 suites and 864 standard value resort size rooms. The combination of the suites and the addition of the Disney Skyliner in 2019 has led to prices at Art of Animation routinely looking more like a moderate resort than a value resort. One area where Disney was needed in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks was providing kids with some semblance of understanding about why the world was so different. When I was a kid, Sesame Street helped kids deal with death when Mr. Hooper passed away in real life, and they decided to deal with this real-life issue on the show. Well, it was another Jim Henson property that served as a way to help kids in the aftermath of these tragic events. Babe in the Big Blue House was the most popular show on the Disney Channel, and it even had the critical support after winning Emmy Awards as well. On September 13th of 2002, a little over a year after the towers fell, Babe in the Big Blue House aired the episode Welcome to Woodland Valley. This episode focused on the town of Woodland Valley, where a storm caused a tree to destroy the library. Bear is a volunteer firefighter in the episode, and he conducts a town hall for the town to rebuild the library. One of the reasons the episode was so effective was that the town hall was not only about rebuilding the library, but featured several characters talking about the grief and fear they experienced about the incident. Brad Garrett of Everybody Loves Raymond and Gilbert Gottfried, who had worked with Disney as a voice in Aladdin, both voice characters who lived in the tree that fell on the library. The two characters lost their homes. At the same time, the community lost the library. Not everything the Disney Channel did was so universally loved, however. A lot of the post-9/11 content created for Disney Channel was viewed as borderline military propaganda. The prime example of this would be the movie Tiger Cruise. Coming out in August of 2002, after the United States had already started its second post-9/11 war in Iraq, it follows the strained relationship of a father who is in the military and his daughter who wants to see him more often. Actually, partially based on a true story, the movie features military children getting to see what their Navy fathers do on a daily basis when they are away on duty. When the ship is returning home, the events of 9/11 occur and cause the boat to prepare for the possibility of immediate retaliation or defense. Of course, the sense of patriotism that almost everyone initially felt after watching the towers fall convinced the daughter to understand why her father needs to be away from home so often, and gives her an immense pride in her father's service. Listen, my grandfather was in World War II, and I respect those who have agreed to serve. I also know that there are plenty of brave men and women who serve in the military who don't have the ability to shape policy. They are told to go somewhere, and they go somewhere. This movie is, however, the type of propaganda that doesn't allow for critical thinking into the risks and struggles of serving in the military. The timing of the movie also played a part in the ever-blurred line between 9/11 fear and patriotism and the start of the war in Iraq under false pretenses. Another way Disney Channel tried to help younger viewers deal with the attacks was in a series of shorts called Express Yourself. Now, these short PSAs had existed for years already on the Disney Channel. In the aftermath of 9/11, Disney focused on producing PSAs with their personalities telling their own individual stories about how they handled the events. Celebrities do play a big role in kids' lives, and having them show that type of vulnerability could certainly help kids deal with a lot of different traumatic experiences. The butterfly effects of 9/11 are too great to cover all of the impacts in this episode, from animators having to change a scene in Lilo and Stitch from a spaceship flying through San Francisco, an event that is actually still teased in the movie, to having that spaceship fly through the mountains, to movies being delayed or slightly edited. There are countless ways that such a gigantic event could impact a company with as many tentacles as Disney. As someone who was 21 at the time, I can tell you that we have never gotten back to the way life felt on September 10th of 2001. Disney movies didn't do as well in the following years, and the feeling in the air, the vibe, the zeitgeist may have just altered too much for Disney in the short term. Disney always rebounds, and they did after 9/11. They rebounded after the pandemic closures. That being said, there are still things that worked in movies, television, and theme parks in the summer of 2001 that will never work again. And that's okay. There are always a lot of videos and television specials that show up around this time every year. I specifically did a podcast episode and not a vlog or video because I didn't want to share any of those images. Please remember your mental health in weeks like this. Sometimes it's okay to not fixate on the coverage. Sometimes you don't even realize it, but you see something that puts you back into that state of panic from the immediate aftermath. Be kind to yourself. If you need to talk to someone, even if nothing directly happened to you and it was 24 years ago, trauma is trauma. Reach out to someone. This has been episode 241 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. I promise you this, we will cheer up a ton next week after tackling a sad topic this week. Main Street Electrical Arcade has been on the show before, and next week he will join us to talk about his visit to the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, California. I know this is a destination many of you want to visit, so I thought hearing about it firsthand might help you prioritize it in the right way on your lists. Please do me a favor, make sure you are subscribed to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. It only takes maybe 30 seconds. I will talk to you again next Thursday on the podcast. Until then, have a great week.